For the last 2.5 years, we have all had the privilege of going through a once in a lifetime disruption. There's been COVID-19, labor shortages, there's been demand shocks, there's been supply shocks, there's been inflation, there's been lead times, there's been stimulus. All these things, if you just looked at one of them and tried to deal with one of them, that would be a big challenge. We got all of them in a 2.5-year period. So in the post-pandemic world, agencies need to ensure that their infrastructure is resilient, as we've been talking about today, and that supply chains are more reliable and we do what we can to eliminate risk. And so engineers, product managers, contractors, city officials, everybody in this room will face these challenges as they try to deliver their projects on time and on budget in an efficient and effective manner. And just hoping that things are going to go back to pre-pandemic what it was before is really wishful thinking. Societal change has happened, and the way that work is done has changed. You've heard that today with some of the panelists that have been on the table. The way that we do work is not going back to the way it was 2.5 years ago. And so new strategies and opportunities exist to disrupt. And for those of us that are willing to take them, there's great opportunities. So today we have a panel of experts here, and we're going to examine some of those new ideas and share those strategies with you as we navigate those challenges. My name is Brian King. I work for Advanced Drainage Systems. We, like I said, if you're here this morning, we are the largest plastics corrugated pipe manufacturer in the US. We just got an approval here in Texas to be able to use corrugated plastic pipe for TxDOT, and we're very happy about that. We just like to compete in markets and on projects, and we let the products speak for themselves. That's all I'm going to say about pipe, but if anybody wants to talk about pipe or drainage or any type of basin or maybe a storage system, I'll be around. With me on the panel, I have Alan Rudder. He's the Division Head, Freight and Investment Analysis, System Planning Group at Texas A&M Transportation Institute. I have Jason Sharp. He's the Vice President, Project Acquisitions at Zachary Construction Corporation. And I have Sherry Pfeiffer. She's the Freight Systems Branch Manager at the Texas Department of Transportation, or TDOT. So I'm going to ask you, this is the only time I'm going to ask you the same question, but over the last 2.5 years, we've had many, many changes. What I would like you to do is talk about the one thing that you believe has had the biggest impact on our ability to deliver projects on time and within budgets. And I'll start with you, Alan.
Well, let's see. Something we do. Okay. The one thing would be the fragility of the supply chains themselves. We're still a global economy, and so a lot of people today have been talking about lead times on certain components. I've talked to chassis manufacturers who wanted domestically manufactured chassis for containers, and they say we still have components that we have to get from China. The same thing is true for a lot of supplies and materials for major highway projects, like structural steel and a whole bunch of other things.
Okay. Sherry. We're going to have to play past the microphone.
Yeah. No, I would absolutely agree with Alan. You'll hear more about it later, probably from me, but looking at the supply chain itself, and it's not just what's coming overseas. Sometimes it's things that have come up through Mexico or down from but there's disruptions. COVID-19 is a huge one. It didn't just impact, we all had to stay at home. Our buying patterns changed. We've become such a consumer's market. Whereas in 2050, our tonnage is outpacing our population growth. So if you really think about that, it shows you how much and how often we're doing the online ordering, the e-commerce. So I would say it's COVID-19 has had a ripple effect on almost everything.
Absolutely. And finally, Jason.
So it was COVID was a double-edged sword in construction. So first off, you had no traffic. So deliveries, people out there working, you got better productions, you got higher capacities, not as much inspection because they're working from home. And you really hit some milestones in some of your construction work. The bad side of that was your people get sick, you had to shut the jobs down, everyone went home, you'd have delays from that, and then you started having transportation delays on materials coming in. And then you actually bid some work during that time frame as well, and you didn't recognize the fact that, hey, everyone's gone, there's no traffic out here. So you win a job that has tons of traffic, but it wasn't there when you bid it. So you get all of this nice backlog work, and now it's impacted again because everyone's out there traveling again, slowing things down, things that you didn't anticipate. And then you have massive supply chain issues, fuel increases, all your material suppliers are jacking up their prices, and you have a backlog of work that is the highest that you've ever had in history, and you have no recourse to try to get recouped from that. So
Yeah, we're going to talk about some of those challenges because the lead time has certainly got longer. And when you're bidding a project, you bid at a price and you expect that price to hold. And, again, pre-pandemic, really didn't have to worry too much about that now with what we've been seeing. So we'll dig into that in a little bit. But I want to start with Sherry because TxDOT has been doing some things that are quite interesting. And you've recently, as we talked, as we're setting up for this, TxDOT has recently integrated analysis of supply chains into your freight plans. And what industries did you look at, and what were some key takeaways when you started to look at that? I think it's interesting that you could just say, "Hey, we've got what we manage," but you actually looked at your customers and you actually looked at what they need in the state of Texas, and then you worked that into your plan, which I think is pretty unique. And I don't know if a lot of departments of transportation are actually doing that. So who did you talk to? What'd you find out?
Well, so Governor Greg Abbott has identified 5 key industries in Texas. That's advanced manufacturing, construction, warehousing and distribution, petroleum, and agriculture. So we took those 5 industries and looked at those, and we even broke advanced manufacturing into electronics and automotive parts so that we could really see what are the key goods moving through our state and how does TxDOT play a role in making sure those goods are moving efficiently and effectively on all modes. I know we're not in charge of the railroads, we're not in charge of the ports, but at some point, everything that comes through those supply chains is on a truck, train, plane, or a ship. So it's really critical that as the state agency, we're looking at that because all in all, this all leads to us being an economically competitive state. And our economic success is tied to how all of this is moving through the state. So we took those key supply chains and we had a supply chain working group where we met with automotive manufacturers, we met with the U.S. Forestry Division, we met with oil and gas companies, and in warehousing and distribution like HEB, and we talked about, is this how your supply chain flows? Do we have it correct? Is it going in, ship, train, plane, whatever the flow was for each industry. We wanted to make sure that we were looking at that and saying, okay, now as TxDOT, what parts can we control? Where are there choke points? Looking at congestion and mobility. Majority of our population in the state lives in the Texas Triangle. So when we looked at these flows and we overlaid it with our congestion maps, you could see where all those key supply chains, all the choke points were in the Texas Triangle, essentially. And then when you looked at a few things, you might see a little bubble up in Permian Basin or at our border crossings. So we really wanted to look at those things so that we can translate it into where can we eliminate these choke points.
And I think it's important to think about, we've talked about some of the investments that we make today have an impact over the next, potentially 100 years. So thinking about what happens from a macro sense and how that actually drives down, I think is a very interesting way to think about it. So I'm going to ask the next question to you, Alan, because you do some research into this space. And so we've seen that those material supply chains have struggled over the last 2 years on many aspects. So in your capacity in the research that you do into infrastructure and supply chains, can you please share some of the learnings that you've had about how that relates to what we should do today? How do we impact supply chain delivery? And how do we get ourselves out of this situation?
Well, the good news is that I think the infrastructure itself really performed fairly well. If you look at the expansion of e-commerce activity and the ability for a lot of that stuff to move on our roadway network as it is currently situated, I think the physical infrastructure was pretty good. The problems come up in the fact that consumption patterns change so quickly, and we can talk about some of the supply chain implications of that. And then just the nature of business relationships and the institutional handoffs to get goods from one mode to the other. I think when some of the consumption patterns happened and then e-commerce came about, then everybody started ordering everything from China all at once. And then you end up with a situation where there are 120 ships off the ports of LA and Long Beach all at once. And then clearing all of that out really depended on a whole bunch of different actors, getting the terminals to work a lot more fast, getting drayage out of those places, getting warehouses to accept it. The fact that none of those three parts of the supply chain operate on a 24/7 basis. So a lot of our supply chain issues happen because of institutional relationships, not necessarily the infrastructure. But I think you also had some consumption pattern changes that had influences on supply chains. At the early part of the pandemic, and we all started hoarding toilet paper, the fact of the matter was the guys who manufacture that stuff, and you can imagine how much they enjoy going home and telling their kids what they do for a living. Yeah, we manufacture toilet paper. One of the things that they had to deal with was the fact that nobody was in the office anymore, and so the boxes and warehouses full of commercial grade toilet paper weren't going anywhere. But everybody wanted the high grade stuff, which they didn't have in those warehouses. So consumption patterns affected the ability to match manufacturing and warehousing to those changing consumption patterns.
And then that exposed every pinch point that we had, right? When Sherry was talking about intermodal and the ability to move from boat to ship to whatever your transportation was, all those pinch points became exposed. And Jason, you are the person that has to do those projects that fix those pinch points. So when you look at that, can you talk about the different approaches that you're taking to be able to deliver more projects with, you mentioned you had issues as it relates to workforce. We have issues as it relates to materials and supply chain, but I'm pretty sure that when you get a contract, they don't want to hear that from you. What they want to do is say, hey, how are you going to get after that? So can you talk about what you're doing differently today through either design, bid, build, or alternative delivery? What innovation have you driven?
Well, we've kind of got a little bit of an advantage on some contractors around here. I mean, Zachary's been around for 99 years. So when we make a deal with a material supplier, they typically want to hold to it because we've been around so long. Smaller contractors may be the ones that get the short end of the stick on that when I get my supply, but they may not get theirs. So it's really hard to, try to evaluate that. But what we look at on our jobs now is we evaluate where our competitive advantages are. If we have material supplies in those locations, that'll help us stay and guarantee to the owners that we can complete the job on time and never have any supply chain issues. And then we'll go after those jobs. We look at areas that we don't have those supplies, and we may not bid those projects anymore, especially if we've had a supplier that has shortchanged us. So we're getting a little bit tighter knit on what we're going to bid. We do a lot of communication with our vendors and our subcontractors to make sure, first of all, electrical, they can get all their supply, they can do it timely, all the street signs, anyone doing lime stabilization or anything like that for us. Our cement products, no matter where we're at, we're trying to make sure that we're getting those locked in. But it's a constant communication. It's a teamwork situation that if you don't have it, you may not get your supply when the job starts going. And our contracts are pretty strict, so we will hold you to those too. But it's up and down on how you do that. But we're getting pickier on the jobs that we go after, and we're raising our margins. We had some of our largest backlog in 2019. Well, you heard Williams this morning say that prices have gone up 30% in just 1 year. Imagine having $1 billion worth of work as a backlog. It goes up 30% and you have to complete it for the prices that you gave. So we've got to hold our people accountable for what they bid to us so that we can complete it on time and complete it for the owner. Some states are providing escalations and some are not. So we take a look at the states that actually have escalations, and we're likely to bid work in those areas because there's some assurances on the fluctuation of materials. I've got other examples of that, but a couple of them have even reached back and as far back as July of 2020 and provided escalations for materials that you bid from that time frame and what you've completed up through 2021. So one of the things I think that the state needs to do is work with FHWA on ways that they can help provide escalations for existing projects, because those are the bigger losers. Right now, you're seeing 30% price increases on jobs because we're losing money on the back end. If you can help out on the back end with the IIJA money, that's really where the money should be spent, because you don't have enough shelf jobs ready to go to shovel anyways. But you've got all this backlog that you can't complete because no one wants to do the work at the higher prices till they de-escalate.
It makes total sense. I'm gonna just poke on something you said there, and we're gonna just bounce back to you with one more question. When you get into that pre-acquisition project planning piece, knowing that there certain materials are going up at prices faster than others, has that changed how you select materials and products?
It changes how I escalate it. Sometimes you can't change. You gotta hit the specifications. So maybe there is a specialty type of product that you have to buy. You just escalate it more, or you may even pay for it.
Okay.
Get stockpile payments. You can request stockpile payments from the owners most of the time. Materials on hand, they want it separated, so we do a lot of that. Mm-hmm. I've even talked to some of our internal, we have a cement plant and an aggregate facility, and they receive prepayments for materials and they stockpile them and they identify them for those projects, and that's available for those other owners or those other vendors. So there's a lot of contingencies that you can do to help sustain what you're doing. We have to follow the specification as far as the type of materials. In your instance, you're working on changing cement pipe to flexible pipe here. So, those are the kind of things we'll look at. Right. But you still got to get approval on those. So
there's a check under your chair for mentioning that. I appreciate that. That wasn't the intent, but
I thought you were taking me to the Masters.
Definitely appreciate it. Oh, is that what's going on? I'm going to ask Sherry. A lot of what's happened and a lot of what Jason talked about was material supply and where it is. And at the federal level, there's been a spotlight that's been shined on the need for truck parking and the ability to actually get trucks where you need them and make sure that you've got space to do that. Given the supply chains and what you've been doing, what's TxDOT doing to address those issues for not necessarily just keeping trucks on the road, but where do they go when they're not on the road?
We started, this was pre-pandemic, we did a statewide truck parking study, and it ended about 3 weeks into the pandemic, which was made for an interesting closure of the study. But, we identified a lot of the areas where there was shortage. We identified, where are trucks parking on the shoulder of the road? Where are they parking on the ramps? And one of the big things is talking about they're not parking there because they want to. They're parking there because the other option may be 2 hours away, but their appointment's 15 minutes down the road. Or the place 2 hours away didn't have a space. So we really looked at the inventory and the utilization and produced our study in April of 2020. And now we're working on an implementation phase. So we're diving a little deeper, and we're doing district truck parking plans. So this is taking what we found in the statewide and applying it at the local level. So we're currently working in Houston and Beaumont, and then El Paso out to Fort Stockton, looking at opportunities there where we can find places that maybe we've closed a rest area or a picnic area, so that we can start looking at where is a good opportunity for us to not only reopen those, but also some of it is looking at just simply restriping. If you restripe a lot in some angled parking, you may add 5 spaces. And then our maintenance division is doing a huge program that started, I believe, last year, but we're dedicating $30 million a year to improve truck parking across the state. That doesn't mean TxDOT's taking on all the truck parking needs. To put it in perspective, 90% of truck parking in the state is managed by the private sector. We only have 10%. At current levels, I would say TxDOT has 2,300 parking spaces at safety rest areas. The safety or the truck stops, they're at 25 to 27,000 spaces. So they still have the lion's share of the capacity, but that's still just not enough for the number of trucks that need to park every single day. So we're working on increasing our capacity, but then also working with the private sector and saying, how can we work together to make sure that whether it's a shared lot or talk about, hey, we have this disposable right away. So these are all kind of new conversations happening, but where we can start partnering on stuff like that, just to make sure that we can provide drivers with a safe place to park. Because if you look back to even the pandemic, some states closed their safety rest areas. So it was like these guys and ladies, they're still trying to get us the toilet paper to the grocery store, but they had no place to stop and eat. And then places were closing safety rest areas. So it's one of those things where I think it's a big cycle that sometimes we never realized was a part of the whole supply chain.
And just a little follow up on that. You said you did the study just before COVID, based on some of the things that we heard Alan talk about. How valid were your numbers? I mean, or did everything change? You finished your survey and you're like, oh, great. Now COVID, everything's changed.
Our numbers were still valid. I mean, to this day, if you drive up and down 35 in Bell County, just outside of Temple and Belton, there are trucks parked at that safety rest area. And they're also parked along the shoulder to get in, the shoulder to get out. If you go up to Dallas and you take I-30 to Texarkana, every single exit has trucks on it to this day. So those numbers were the same. If anything, we've probably seen more because the amount we're consuming.
Interesting. Wow. Alan, to you, specific to your research around, industries and we just heard about some of the challenges that industries have finding raw materials or getting trucks where they need them and when they need them to be able to give folks like Jason a fighting chance of staying on track. So can you talk a little bit about some of the research you've done around what type of changes you expect to see? And maybe if you got some specific examples of companies as they're trying to onshore. I mean, we've heard about this term onshoring or shortening your supply chains. One of the ways that you manage your supply chain better is to make it shorter, so you don't have as many touch points through that. Can you give some examples of what companies are doing or considering to try to shorten those supply chains?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a couple of different things, both internationally and locally. A lot of people are trying to manage their supply chains by hedging and not having the same things coming through the same places. As the West Coast labor issues have been subject, their current contract expired July of last year, and a whole bunch of companies decided, I'm not really sure when that's going to get resolved, and narrator says it hasn't been resolved yet. But a lot of people have said, well, we don't want to worry about that. We're going to move a lot of our containers through other ports. So Port Houston had 4 million TEUs come through their port this year, a whole lot more than they ever expected. Charleston, Savannah, New York, New Jersey, there's been a whole shift in how containers are moving into the country because people are sort of hedging and managing their supply chains that way. I think the other thing that you see about that onshoring, you can see that happening in warehouse development, and both in Laredo, in the Valley, and in El Paso. Huge amounts of both speculative and purpose-built warehousing going in. The World Trade Bridge, as it comes north in Laredo, used to be you'd have a really nice road that took you to the freeway. Now there's millions of square feet of warehouse that's out there and more coming. So I think we're seeing a lot of that anticipation of reshoring and nearshoring happening by people getting out ahead of that and anticipating that. I think the other thing in starting to think about how to shorten those supply chains is a good example of that is the new semiconductor capacity that's being manufactured here in Texas, enormous scale. But even thinking about how you build those things, the Samsung guys who are putting in a $30 billion plant just outside of Taylor, one of the things that they have taken advantage of is there's a rail transloading facility right next to it. And they got the county, Williamson County, to give them one of the roads that was through their property, and it's now not a public road anymore. And they've actually built a batch plant at that transloading facility and then truck the concrete over to their plant on, using, really, really heavy trucks, but it's on their own property, so they don't have to worry about that. And so it's one of those things where they've taken advantage of, let's find a way of building this facility with the shortest supply chain that we can find.
I think we've heard examples of that on stage today, where companies are looking for, and when they look for site location, they look for all those things, right? So they say, access to an airport, check; access to freeways, check; ports, check, right? How do we get after that? And similar to where I live in Columbus, Ohio, they're building a big fab plant in Columbus, Ohio as well too. And Intel, who's moving there, went through some of those exact same conversations. Where are we located? Is there a rail spur here? How close are we to highways to be able to get raw material components here? And then looking at it not just from a once we're up and operating, but how do we actually build our facility as well too? So really interesting insights, and I think we're seeing that all the way across the country. And if to the point you made, Sherry, if you want to be a leader, we have to make those investments in the state that you're in, because people are going to make those choices where to make those investments. So with that, we're sort of winding a little bit down on time, but I'm going to go to Sherry again. Keeping infrastructure resiliency and reliability in mind, we've heard a lot about resiliency and reliability in mind. What are some of the needs that have been identified around multimodal freight networks, where all those different points come together, and specifically in the state of Texas? What have you seen? What's that impact? What are you guys doing to make sure that that's as seamless as possible?
We've seen where one of the biggest things is last mile connectivity, whether it's between a international border crossing. Once that truck drays across the border, that drayage truck is going to go to a warehouse within probably 10 miles to drop the trailer, and it's going to head back across the border to get more. And then another truck's going to pick that one up and take it. And that's just the truck side. You might have railroad crossing the border, and then it goes to either it stays on the rail or it's going to go to an intermodal yard. And then thinking about, from a technology perspective, the number of connected and automated vehicle pilots we have in Texas. Something we've had to look at, and we are looking at, is, how do we plan for the new age of connected and automated vehicles? If it's a driverless truck someday, for that last mile connectivity, it's going to need a spot to transition to a driver that takes it in for that last mile. Other things just to think about, congestion, it cost trucks about $1.5 billion in 2019. So thinking about that, some of our critical choke points are I-35, I-45, and I-10, which again, Texas Triangle makes it up right there. And then also bringing in the safety piece. That those accidents and crashes, they create the congestion. And then looking also at asset management. So bridge height, pavement integrity, proper dredging of our Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, to make sure those large post-Panamax ships can get through and get to the Port of Houston. So it really is, it's kind of all these little pieces, but it's making sure each mode can connect efficiently and effectively. Because if you have one break in that connection, it throws everything off.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that. The toilet paper example is a great example. Christmas trees was another one, right? Didn't have any Christmas trees in stores, and then suddenly they were in parking lots, in big containers full of them. Jason, to you, let's talk post-acquisition just for a little bit. You said, you bid on a project, you are in that phase. What are you doing to reduce your risk for escalating costs and or supply chain challenges? Like tactically, what are you doing?
So one of the first things we did is we did start calling all of our vendors and just confirming what our first agreements were and if there's any hardships that they had with those. What we didn't want to do is hurt the vendors if if it was going to damage them. Some of these smaller suppliers and so on and so forth, we didn't want anyone going out of business. So we looked what we could do to work with them. And then we approached the DOTs. Sometimes they can't do anything. Their hands are tied by the spec book and how they're supposed to do the escalations or any change orders. So then you start looking for methods in the spec book that will help you. For instance, any type of an owner delay allows you escalations on materials if you get delayed for that. Now, you don't want to have to approach those. That's not really the good way to do business. But in these instances, the state has actually said, you need to approach it this way. This is how we can get that passed through so the feds can pay for this. In North Carolina actually came out with kind of a progressive approach to this, where they actually sent out a memo, and that's where they stated that if you've placed materials between July of 2020 through July of 2021, send us what your material price costs were and send me what your original bid price was. And if there's an escalation, we'll pay that escalation. They also had sent in a commodity list of other materials that you could submit, but they would do almost any material on a job. They wouldn't do labor. Labor's still one that's lagging. We got to figure out how to fix that problem. But on the material side, they approached that and allowed us to submit on jobs. And then they identified design build jobs that had maybe been let even way before that, like 2017 and 18, and allowed you to do some escalations on those as well. South Carolina did a different approach. They gave you a commodity list and they escalated it based on an index that they determined. So you could go in there, see what your quantities were in those materials and submit for an increase on those. Texas is a little bit harder. That's the one where they've asked us to maybe do some time impact analysis or delay analysis for that and put some escalations into those costs. I think there needs to be a better method for helping the contractors to recoup the losses from the past, and that's why you're seeing huge price increases now. Is because we're trying to get it on the back end, and at least the material suppliers are. We've seen the material suppliers go up in price 200% on some items. So, you know, they're locking that in, and we're hoping not to lock them in and de-escalate it later. So.
Right. And we didn't touch on labor, but I mean, I heard a great quote about labor, which was more labor is not going to solve our labor problem, right? Our labor problem is more systemic than that. It's finding people to do the jobs. It's then paying them a living wage. I mean, it's just having more people probably is not going to solve that problem.
So I had a discussion. I ended up being on a panel in Atlanta with a couple of Biden's transportation and Buttigieg transportation officials. And one of the discussions was, how can we actually get a better wage rate for the existing crews out there, which will attract more people from other industries so that you can get a higher wage? Because currently a laborer gets somewhere between $15 and $20 an hour. So does a guy working at McDonald's. So how do you get them out of McDonald's? You pay them more on the construction side. They'd rather work construction hands-on and build things, I believe. I mean, I did, but we're not paying them. So you got to raise the wages on existing jobs to help the current contracts so they don't lose money while they get the new jobs, which you'll have a new wage decision on them. But the feds have to come out with a means and method to do that. So we've just got to approach Congress and ask them how to do it. So.
And, you know, Congress, that should be easy, right? They'll have an answer to us in a couple of days on how to solve that problem.
Within the next 80 days.
No problem. Well, we're at time, and I want to thank each of you for participating today. Good conversation about supply chains. I mean, I think we did a good job of talking about macro supply chain and how you actually look at removing all those bottlenecks, which provide better infrastructure for the entire state of Texas. And then also thank you, Jason, for digging into, hey, when I'm doing these projects, this is how, if we don't fix this, it makes my life incrementally harder to try to fix the problem. So all of it, both on the micro and the macro sense. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time today. And I think we're going to break. Is that right? No, we're not. We're not doing breaks. That's right. You got up here and just told me we're not going to do breaks. So we're not doing breaks. We're going straight to the next panel. Thank you very much.